thought I'd give you a little history of why I've got a little bit of an interest in community gardens. Back in 2008, or actually I'll go back a little further than that, but Elkhart County has a kind of a rich history of being either one of the lowest unemployment rates in the United States or the highest unemployment rate in the United States. Whenever the things are going well, they're going really, really well. For those that aren't familiar with Elkhart County, we are the RV capital of the world. People buy RVs when there is a lot of cash laying around. And they don't buy them when things aren't going so well. So we tend to have a very up and down economy in Elkhart County. Back in 2008, we had a lady working here in our office that asked me if I could put on a program, because the economy had just went south very, very quickly. Almost all the RV factories and their suppliers had closed their doors within about a 2-day period of time. Very scary. We went from having basically zero unemployment to over 20 or 25% unemployment in a matter of 2 days. And a lot of people, a lot of the churches, a lot of the different organizations here in the community began talking about the need for food and began talking about the need for having maybe community gardens and other things like that. And of course, the local food pantries were worried. Everybody was really worried. It was a really dark and scary time back there in 2008. So Erin Cataldo was working here in the extension office, and she offered to put on this program and feed the people who were coming to that program from their family restaurant up in Elkhart. So we ended up with a good crowd, and I put together this little PowerPoint. And the other day when things started going south again here, I dusted off this PowerPoint and thought, I wonder if this is any good. I ran it past a couple of my coworkers, and they said, absolutely, let's do something with it. So here we are today. And I've added a little bit to the presentation now because obviously the situation here is different. We've got COVID-19 to deal with. And so I put a few extra things in there about COVID-19 and how to deal with that in community gardens. So, and I guess I'll just go ahead and jump in to start the talk now. I've got everybody's mutes or mics muted. And what I will try to do is have questions at the end. So I'll kind of go through the materials. If you got some questions, go ahead and save those up for the end. Okay, so we'll get started then. I'm going to figure out how to share my screen here. And we will go forward. So does anybody see my screen now at this point?
Not yet.
Not yet? Okay.
I think we're hearing somebody else's mic, but now we see it. Now we see it, Jeff.
You see the screen now?
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay, yeah, make sure your mics stay muted or else we might get some feedback and such, so. Okay. Well, I'm glad so many people have taken an interest in this. It is a little bit of a passion for me, so I'm glad that we do have some interest in this. But from what I've seen, community gardens can be the best thing in the world. I mean, they are better than sliced bread. And well, let's see. Are you seeing just the PowerPoint, or are you also seeing the group of people there?
Just the PowerPoint, Jeff.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, I just want to make sure.
PowerPoint.
Great. Thank you for letting me know. Okay, community gardens can be the best thing since sliced bread. It feeds the hungry. It gives people a sense of purpose during a really rough time a lot of times. a sense of belonging to something greater than themselves, and that's always a good feeling. It helps to bring a community together oftentimes, and it also provides fresh vegetables, which is something that, let's face it, a lot of people eat junk food these days. So getting some fresh vegetables into people's hands is always a good thing. But on the flip side, community gardens can be a huge disappointment to people. Oftentimes there's a lot of people out there with very good intentions, and they don't realize what they're getting into. Probably, as I'll talk about a little bit later, what the biggest headache is probably when people run into these spells of really hot, dry weather, and or when the weeds take over. Weeds and hot weather are probably the two biggest disappointments that are out there in community gardens. Another is just plain lack of water. That affects a lot of things. Make sure you're muting your mics. You might end up with some issue with tools being available, shade issues, little petty conflicts between people, cultural differences between people, some poor soils, all kinds of things can make community gardens a big issue. Somebody's got their mic on, so let's see. So anyway, let's see. So I found this slide a few years ago, and I just loved it. It kind of sums up everything about community gardens that can go wrong. Kale is overrated. You got somebody chasing off somebody who's stealing vegetables. People getting in fights about territorial issues. Your melons are squeezing out my tomato plants, or vandalism. Remember one time I was on a group that was visiting Chicago, and we went to a garden in a very poor neighborhood in Chicago, and they had quite a few vandalism problems. Why would people vandalize a garden? I have no idea, but they were having issues with that. There's even somebody back there complaining about a pet that's doing its business in the garden. So, it's things like that just add up and can cause some problems in a community garden at times. So my mission today is kind of help you think about some of the things that could happen or might happen, and maybe help you to avoid some of the issues that may pop up in a community garden. And these things are real. I'm going to let a couple more people in here. Here we go. These things are real. I mean, here's a story in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago talking about some issues with people actually having fights and hurting each other, violent fights and death threats in a garden. Who would have thought that that could actually happen? But, people are crazy sometimes, I guess. So one of the things I always try to encourage people when they're talking about doing a garden of any kind, whether it's community garden or whether it's just a personal garden, is making sure that there's water availability. In Indiana, we're known to have some very wet Aprils and May, and then about somewhere mid-June, July, August, it gets hot and things dry up. And if you don't have water, it can be very discouraging. I had that happen to me one time. I had a garden out back behind a local TV station, a demonstration garden. They had one faucet, and it was clear on the other side of the station. By the time the hose got to the garden, there was no water pressure left, and it was really a very, very long summer trying to water that garden. So make sure you get water, or you probably just don't need to do it at all. Sunshine. Most of these gardens are for vegetables, and vegetables require 8 hours plus of sunshine. And 8 hours plus is quite a bit of sunshine. Very few trees nearby. It's nice to have some trees nearby so the volunteers have some place to go to cool off. But if those trees throw a little shade on that garden, it really disrupt a lot of the nutrients being produced by those plants and just slow everything down in that garden. Another comment that I've got there is no walnut trees. And for those of you that aren't familiar with walnut trees, they are the scourge of some plants in gardens, particularly tomato plants. They produce a natural herbicide in some respects called juglone. And juglone secreted by the leaves, it's secreted by the root system. And plants growing near the root system in particular just fade away, particularly tomato plants. Tomato plants and juglone get along very, very poorly. So if you have walnut trees nearby, that is probably not a good site. You can't just cut the walnut tree down and expect that garden to start growing. It takes a number of years before the juglone breaks down in the soil. It can take a long, long time. Well-drained soils are very, very good as far as gardens are concerned. Sand isn't so bad. A lot of people complain about sand because it's too dry. But the good thing about sand is you can get out there, you can water it, and a few hours later get out there and start working in it again too. So sand is not always a bad thing in a garden. The one thing you don't want to do is add sand to a clay soil or add clay to a sandy soil, because what you'll find is that you'll end up with a soil that doesn't drain very well at that point. I've got one person I need to admit to our meeting here. Okay. A lot of folks in these circumstances are offered an old city lot, for instance, or sometimes they have a lot nearby their home or near their church, and they say, hey, maybe we can use that lot since it's been abandoned for a number of years to grow some vegetables and do some good for once for that lot. A key thing is, do you have permission? If it's owned by the city, if it's owned by an absentee landlord, you still need to have permission there. There's some liability issues with that. Also, things like lead, other contaminants can be in that. You do not want to be messing around with a lot that's in a bad situation environmentally. And then also, a lot of times the soils in those old lots, maybe they've ripped out the foundation or they backfilled where the foundation had been with some old cruddy soil. It's not necessarily good soil. Might be just really poor drainage or something. You just don't know what you're going to end up with there. So it's good to explore that before you say, yeah, I'm going to put my community garden in that location. Tools are always a big issue. It's good to have a secure place where you can keep some tools. It makes it a lot more handy for the people that are working in a community garden. You know, it's difficult for people to haul their tools back and forth. They get dirt or mud in their cars sometimes and that sort of thing. So if you can find a place where you can secure tools, that is wonderful. Now, in this age of COVID, that could possibly create some issues with passing the virus along. So if you do have a common set of tools, you do to figure out a way to be able to sterilize those tools, wipe them down with a bleach solution or something to keep the virus from passing from one person to the next. Another question becomes, is it going to be a permanent site? It's kind of heartbreaking. I've seen people put a lot of money and effort into building a permanent site, maybe even with some raised beds and walkways and trellises and that sort of thing. And then 2 or 3 years later, the owner of the lot or the city will come in and just clean it out. And sometimes they don't even tell them. And so all that work that's gone into building up the soil, putting in the trellises or the woodwork or the plots or the walkways is just kind of gone. So that's questions you may want to be asking is, is this going to be a permanent site, or is this going to be something that's temporary? And then you can kind of make a decision about how much investment you want to make in that area in the long run. I always tell people when they're starting to garden, and I think it'd be true too for a community garden, is start small, because you just don't know how big this thing is going to get. But it's probably better to start off small and then expand it over time than it is to start out with a 50 by 50 monstrosity with 3 people helping to work it and hoping that others will jump in. Start out with, if you've got 5 or 6 people that are interested, start out with 5, 10 by 10 plots and go from there, and then hope over time you can get some expanse from that point. I've also seen several different kinds of community gardens that are out there. You have what I would call neighborhood community gardens. They might be church or some sort of a center organized type of event. Maybe there's a church in a community and they're asking the neighbors if they'd like to come over and have a spot, for instance. We had one like that up in Elkhart a couple of years ago. We also have neighborhood gardens that are kind of citizen organized. Don't forget to mute. I'm going to mute mics again here. There we go. Citizen organized type of a garden might be something like just some neighbors that are saying, hey, let's do something together. We can get out of the house and do something and also do some good for the community. It does help to get people together. They have a common cause to get some food produced there. We've seen youth and school gardens. Usually they're organized around some kind of a club or a school. I've had a request already in the last week about a school wanting to put together a garden. My experience for them has been not so good, unfortunately. What tends to happen with the school gardens is everybody's really excited, and then summer hits and the kids have gotten involved in their little league and their soccer and that sort of thing, and they just kind of disappear, and the organizers kind of feel like, oh man, what happened and what should we do, and they turn into a weed patch. So I haven't seen very many of those types of gardens really come through in the summer months. I think it takes some really good leadership, a lot of organization, and maybe just understanding that these people are busy too. Now, this year, with COVID being the main reason that we're not doing activities, that may be different. But in 2008, certainly by around the 15th of June, 15th of July, in that range, the other activities caught up to a lot of these youth and school gardens that popped up. Oh, there we go. We also have some job skills or training type of therapy gardens. A lot of times those are coordinated by an agency. We've seen those at jails. We have a local organization here that caters to handicapped individuals, and they've had therapy gardens at their location before. Again, it requires somebody who has the ability to pull these people together, keep them going, and that's a good thing. It can end up giving them some skills and maybe some interest, and help them to develop as a person a little bit more. Demonstration garden, that would be a situation like the Master Gardeners might do. We've got Purdue Extension has a Master Gardener program. Demonstration gardens would be an example of maybe we're putting out some plots on how to grow trellised beans, or maybe how to set up a garden so that the shade from the sweet corn isn't falling onto the other plants and causing them problems, or just even how to garden. There's a lot of people that have lost that skill over the years, so demonstration garden is often a good thing. It's usually associated with some kind of organization such as a garden club or Master Gardeners. Food pantry gardens are like they sound. They're made for the purpose of providing food for an organization. So a good example here in Elkhart County might be the Middlebury Food Pantry, or Church Community Services, which is a huge organization that provides a lot of fresh fruit and vegetables for local groups. Communal gardens, another type of garden that are community gardens. They're often associated with a like a faith-based group, and they often will assign tasks to a person. You know, you have this block, and that's your job to keep it weeded, and they're usually a fairly regimented type of a garden to keep everybody sort of to make sure that the tasks are done. So it really comes down how you're setting up your community garden. Really kind of comes down to what you're trying to accomplish. Is this a community garden where the growers are feeding others? In this case, maybe people that have been laid off. Or is this a garden that's intent is for people to grow their own? Maybe they live in an apartment and they don't have land where they can grow their own food. So part of that, how you design your garden, comes down to one of those two issues. Is it for you? Is the food being produced for you? Or is the food being produced for others? Here we go. When you're growing feed for others, typically it's donated directly to some kind of an organization. Here it might be a food pantry or Church Community Services, the Window, Faith Mission. Every community's got their own groups of that help the needy in their community. You know, the motive there is usually fairly strong. Right now, there's a pretty strong motive. There's a lot of people that have been laid off in various communities around Indiana. And, you know, working with these groups that are already organized is very helpful because they already know how to handle food. They already know how to do things to get it to the people that need it and who want that food, versus trying to set up your own channels and connections. It's really good, I think, if you can get those connections established with groups that are already out there. Yeah, it's very difficult to pull together neighborhood groups, especially here we are in late April. It's going to be very difficult to pull together a neighborhood group and that sort of thing to get everybody kind of on board. Those efforts usually have to start sometime, say in January, February, March, for those to be very successful. And if you're setting up gardens for people to feed themselves or their family, the motivation there's pretty clear. They need food. They will generally be there to try to help themselves. Their space may be limited, maybe by where they live. They may live in an apartment or something like that. But they might not be the type of personality that has a lot of comfort in working with other people, or they may really enjoy people. So that's one of the things you got to take into account. So it sort of has to work with those individuals. My experience has been that there are many gardeners who are very good at social activities, and there are many gardeners that are not. They tend to, some folks tend to relate better to plants than they do to people. And those are usually pretty phenomenal growers if you think about it. But they may not have the best social skills in the process either. So anyway, it is something to think about. And it does, in these days of having social distancing involved in gardening, we do need to think about that social distancing aspect of having a community garden, because we don't want too many people hanging around that 50 by 50 area, possibly getting into somebody else's space. Some people can be very sensitive about that issue. So there's another aspect of community gardens to think about is you can have the one great big garden where you you assign tasks. Maybe John's job is to go out and weed all of the plots in the northeast corner, while Allison gets to go out and water the garden every other day from 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. before the people arrive to do their daily tasks. So the other philosophy is individual tasks, where you get your 10 by 10 spot and you are responsible for everything, including maybe hauling the water, planting the plants, doing the harvesting. And then there's hybrids of those, where you might have I'll call them a drill sergeant, basically, somebody who's in charge of deciding when the garden needs to be watered. They just send out an email or a post on the board, a community board, that says we're going to be watering on Tuesday, so don't plan on doing anything Tuesday morning. That's when the water's going on. So all different kinds of philosophies can come up there. So the key thing is, in this day and age right now, is how do we do all these things and try to avoid the COVID-19 virus spreading from one person to the next. It's the last thing you probably want. For those individual plots, maybe one of the key things is that they have access to water and tools. Now remember, these are folks that probably do not have access to land to begin with. And so the reason that they're thinking about joining this garden is because they don't have land. That probably means they also don't have tools. And so it's a very difficult task for them to be able to participate in a community garden without the tools, of course. So having tools is pretty important. And then, of course, if you have tools at the garden, then you need to have some place to store them. So one of these little tool sheds, or some sort of a locked up facility where the tools won't be stolen, that sort of thing, is probably a pretty important thing for those kind of circumstances. Typically, where you have individual plots, of course, people are very individualistic in our community or in our nation, so they want to do what they can. So you may have somebody that just really loves growing watermelon, or they love growing some sort of a vine crop like watermelon, or perhaps cucumbers or something like that, something that spreads. And those can get into other people's lots or property pretty quickly. So you may have to have rules about those kind of things. Pathways can be a concern. Where's the pathways going to be so that their plants are not growing into the pathways and tripping people up. Another rule would be about pesticides. Some gardens do not allow pesticide use in the gardens themselves. That's prohibited in those gardens. So how do you do the insect control should something come in and start doing that? Or perhaps one of the people in that individual plot doesn't like pesticides used in their garden, but the spot next door to them has a weed issue or an insect issue, and they want to use a pesticide to get the potato bugs off of their potatoes. So that can be a huge issue. When do we water and how much water do we put on can also be an issue in those individual plots. And then also common fertility plans. If one person's adding a lot of fertilizer to their place or manure, you can end up with a kind of a hodgepodge of different fertility rates within the garden, and especially if the garden plots rotate from one location to the next from year to year, that can be kind of frustrating for those people who are working on a philosophy of building up the fertility in their particular lot. So it really does come down, if you're going to have an individual plot, it really comes down to having a common agreement. And one of the things I'm going to post on the website when we put up the video is some agreements that you can use with people that are trying to do individual lots. Something about sharing their tools, just kind of laying out the expectations more than anything about what the behavior should be within the garden, how they're going to work with others, and that sort of thing. It gives the organizers a chance, if there is somebody who's just very difficult to work with, a chance to go talk to them and say, look, you promised you were going to be like this. You're actually acting like that. We really need to have this conversation. So it is good. It's good to have those things done up front versus not. And I know nobody wants to have paperwork involved with a garden. This is supposed to be fun, and it's supposed to be about community. But we are people, and we do have problems with those kind of issues every once in a while. So I mentioned before, who gets to decide who does these things? Is there a manager, a committee, that sort of thing? Some gardens will have somebody that I like to call the drill sergeant. That person they are the absolute authority. They are the manager. They are the person that you go to if you've got an issue. Or you might have a committee. I know our Master Gardener group up in Elkhart has got a community garden, and they kind of do everything by committee. They're a group of friends that are also Master Gardeners, and they do have a committee. They work on that. And you may have a group meeting occasionally, that sort of thing. Of course, these days, any kind of group meeting is probably going to be online like this. It's just very difficult to get people together without spreading the virus at this point. You may set up an email group. Maybe you have a bulletin board, a clipboard on a nail. If it's through a church, perhaps church announcements can be used, but communication becomes incredibly important. Facebook group could be important too. Just getting the word out there about what's going to happen today. So let's say the person in charge of watering is going to say, okay, we are going to water on Wednesday. So they make sure that gets out there on Facebook so the other members of that group are aware of what's going on. And then with the one big garden aspect of things, is also a decision needs to be made where the produce is going, how it's going to be divided. Most of the time, it's pretty clear. The group decides, hey, it's going to be going to the window, or it's going to be going to church community services, or it's going to be going to the food pantry in Napanee, for instance. Places like, most of the time we already know where that's going, but it needs to be talked about, decided before we get too far down the path. When you're going to involve neighbors, it's really important that you get that process started early. We're pretty late in the game already, being towards the end of April. So if you are thinking about putting some plots in that are going to involve neighbors, I would say get some sort of a neighborhood meeting scheduled via Zoom or WebEx, some kind of technology like that, or knock on some doors, talk to people, and say, hey, we're thinking about doing this. Would you be interested? And see what the reaction is. It's nice to have neighbors involved in a garden, or at least let them be informed of what's going on, because in many circumstances, those neighbors can also be your watchdogs for the garden. If some kids get bored and they want to go out and start throwing tomatoes at each other, it's those neighbors that are often will be there in the evenings that'll see them messing with somebody's garden, and they can be the ones that kind of call you and say, hey, you got some kids messing around, why don't you come over and chase them off? Or they might even go out and chase them off themselves. But the neighbors can often be kind of the police for that garden. And it's good to have meetings leading up to opening the garden, having those people involved. And of course, we're getting right there right now already. So any sort of way you can communicate with people, the neighbors, Facebook, email, that sort of thing, of course, is important too. So some of these people will not have very much experience with doing gardening. So if you can form a garden club, have some kind of an educational session, that's often very helpful too. Of course, Purdue Extension is very involved in doing Master Gardeners. And that's a big possibility of using master gardeners to help out with some of that education. However, we have to be real careful. We don't want the master gardeners getting sick either. So I would encourage some sort of a Zoom meeting or WebEx for doing some teaching, or just having a general question and answer session if somebody has that. Maybe you set it up on every Wednesday and Friday at 6. People can call in and ask their questions, or email questions to those people that are kind of the go-to people for answers. In some circumstances, you may even have gardens that have to collect money or pay bills or water, and of course, then you need to have somebody that operates a treasury. That is getting pretty sophisticated, and on a short notice like that, that's probably not practical for 2020. But you probably will need people that can help to resolve any kind of conflicts, because again, it's surprising, but they do end up with some conflicts from time to time. And I think one of the best things about the gardens that I've seen, when, for instance, our master gardeners have their garden up in Elkhart, one of the things that they've done is they've got a few people from outside the master gardener community that come and rent these plots, and they're there to help that person answer with questions. And so basically, they're there to mentor these new gardeners and help them with their questions and such. And even some of the more there's one lady, one of the gardens that is I think originally from Africa, and she's got a lot of experience with gardening, but she does have questions every once in a while. All gardeners have questions every once in a while, and it helps to have master gardeners there or experienced gardeners to help mentor those people that are just having some further questions about things going on in their garden. Basic needs for a garden. We'll kind of switch gears here a little bit. An adequate number of plots, some sort of a laid out path is important. Water and irrigation systems. Again, if you don't have water in a garden in Indiana, chances are it is not going to go very far, because we almost always have hot and dry in July and August, and that tends to do away with a lot of gardens if they don't have water. A tool shed, perhaps, if you're going to be having people come there who don't have tools so they can store some things. A bench in the shade, just because we need that in Indiana. It gets pretty hot sometimes. A workbench to, say, cut up some of the plants, divide them, or do work with the vegetables and package them to haul them to the locations where they're going. A sign with name and contact information. In fact, one of the things I'm going to try to show you here, I think I'll do this maybe in a little bit, is I've got a sign that talks about gardens and visitors to the garden, not to enter the garden because of the COVID restrictions, and not, so that we can protect the people that are working in the garden. Remind me to show you that sign here in a little bit. A shared compost area is very good. Usually if you have a small garden plot like a 10 by 10, you're not going to be able to generate a whole lot of organic material to justify having your own compost pile. But if you've got a whole bunch of 10 by 10 plots and everybody kind of piles it up in one place, you can get a pretty good compost heap going. The key thing is making sure that everybody gets a chance to pull off the compost heap. That's where the arguments tend to come up at. Fencing, animal control. Wow, there's probably nothing more disheartening than getting your tomatoes or your green beans right there where you think they're going to be, and the next thing you know, the groundhogs come in and wipe you down to nothing, because or the raccoons. Raccoons are absolutely horrible about taking stuff the day before you think you're going to harvest. So they always seem to do that. So fencing can become an issue, and that's one of those things that, okay, can we get a donation? Do we have a treasury of some sort to pay for things if we can't get a donation? That's one of those things that you really may want to think about, because it's very disheartening to have 2 months of hard work go south really quick when the coyotes get into your melon patch. And not only do you need water for the plants, but you also need water for the people, because again, it's going to get hot and you need to have water for the people. Many people will bring their own water, but still it's nice to have a source of potable water for people that are working in the garden. And perhaps some sort of a bulletin board, message center, something like that says, okay, we watered this morning. That's good. Basic needs may include money, a treasurer, some sort of seed source. If you're looking for maybe a community garden that's going to feed other people, a lot of times people go out looking for seed sources. Insurance may be something that a lot of people will ignore that, especially if it's associated with a church. But it is something that if individuals are brought in from outside the organization, a lot of times you probably want to be considering, how are we going to cover ourselves if somebody trips over the small wooden box that we've set up over here. Oftentimes the gardens are able to come up with somebody that can do plowing or tilling of some sort, but the going rate is typically $30 to $40 an hour for tillage around here anyway. And a lot of people, if they are going to have to hire it done, they'll have some sort of a basic fee for visiting the garden to begin with. A typical fee around here might be about $50. So if somebody was tilling up a 30 by 60 garden, perhaps, that fee might run up to about $140. But fortunately, I don't hear too many people charging fees for community gardens, especially if it's going to be going to a worthy cause. Another big question comes up with community gardens is, do we use Roundup or glyphosate to burn down the weeds before we get started? You know, you've all read all this stuff online and all the TV ads about glyphosate and cancer and that sort of thing. And your group's going to have to make a decision on that. Personally, I don't have a problem doing that in gardens. I think it's being blown way out of proportion. And I think most of the university types would probably say the same thing. But there are some people that have some very strong feelings about glyphosate, and if you have people like that are working in your garden, they may not want to have that stuff anywhere near their particular plot that they're working, or may not want to work in a plot where that has been applied. It's a decision that the group is going to have to make. So if you're going to get started, very first time ever, I would suggest getting a soil test, and basically any kind of county extension educator that's going to talk about first-time gardeners is going to bring that up, because you got to know where you're kind of starting to begin with. A basic soil test is going to look at basically 4 different things. They're going to look at pH, they're going to look at phosphorus and potassium, and also the cation exchange capacity, which is a measure of how well that soil hangs on to nutrients. And that's going to tell you where you can get started, and whether you need to get some lime put on there, or whether you need to get some sulfur put on there to correct pH issues, or if you've just got a really poor soil to begin with in terms of nutrients. Soil tests are not going to tell you, a standard soil test is not going to tell you if there's lead in that ground, if there's any kind of contaminants, from fuels or anything like that. It's not going to tell you that. That's a specialized test, and those are going to cost a lot more money than a $20 soil test from any sort of lab here that does plant soil testing. So you're going to have people come in and clean up the site. Probably if the site has not been used as a garden, you're going to have somebody come in there, and they may have to haul away some junk. A lot of times if it's an empty lot, that becomes kind of the neighborhood dumping center. So you may have old bicycles or parts and things like that have been dumped there over the years, and the weeds have kind of grown around them. You may run into some things that you're not expecting to see in those gardens. You may find yourself having to install water, spread fertilizer, compost, lime, that sort of thing. It's important to note that if your pH is too high, say above 6.5 or too low, say below 6, putting on lime or putting on sulfur to correct those pH issues is pretty important, but it takes about 6 months for that change to really kick in and start doing you some good. So if you're starting from scratch right now, lime or sulfur called for in a soil test is not going to really benefit you all that much in the summer of 2020. 2021, you're probably going to see some significant changes. Another aspect of community garden is laying out the plots. That usually takes some time. People go out there with some pretty elaborate schemes sometimes of laying out plots with string and that sort of thing. And then you got to get something planted. And that's the fun part. That's probably the easiest part to get people out for, is getting things planted. They enjoy that. And they enjoy the first couple of weeks when things start to grow and you start seeing the benefits of what's going to happen in that garden. And then, of course, there's the mulching and the weeding and the watering. Mulching can help conserve some of the water, may be good for kind of designating where the paths are, where people can walk and not squish everybody else's vegetables. And I guess another part of getting started is you need to take some time to celebrate. By celebrate, I mean do some fun things. This is probably where a lot of the gardens that I've witnessed have maybe not been that good. They just kind of want people to come and do their thing and then provide the vegetables or take the vegetables home with them. But if you can, these days we can't have picnics out at the garden site. It's part of the restrictions on the COVID thing. But if we could have a virtual picnic, maybe from somebody, everybody's in their living room and they've fixed some special dessert with the fruits or the vegetables that are available in that garden. You can do that on Zoom or WebEx or something like that. And maybe give some fun certificates and then just have a discussion. Maybe you can get some pictures put in the paper about what's going on at the garden. People are looking for good news right now. And I think that's probably one of the best things you could do is have some good news like that. What's going on in the community? Here's a garden that's doing something. And I think that would be very, very good for a garden and keeping the morale going, especially when it gets in the 100-degree range or 95-degree range and the humidity's at 110%. That is when things get really rough in a garden. Just a little bit about soil testing since I discussed it. Typical test is going to run you about $20 a sample, maybe $30 a sample if you get the fancy graphics and all that. You really don't need all that. If you do get a soil test done, you can call your county extension office and they can help you interpret it. A sample can represent up to about 3 acres. So most community gardens don't even get close to 3 acres. So you can probably take a general soil test from all over that area when you're just getting started and get a pretty good representation of what the fertility level is in that garden. The best time for taking a soil test is probably in the fall, but we're already past that. So you can get that soil test done now. It'll tell you where your pH is at. If you need to adjust your pH to go up, then you would be putting lime on. If you want to put some sulfur, if your pH needs to go down, you'd be putting some sulfur on there. One big mistake a lot of gardeners make is as soon as things don't look right, the first thing they run out and do is buy a bag of lime and they throw it on the garden. And at least in Elkhart County, a lot of our soils don't need lime. They need sulfur to bring the pH down. We have a lot of pHs that are in the 7.5 to 8 range in our community. And that's just too high, and putting lime on will make it even worse. Other considerations to think about: raised beds. Raised beds are a nice thing if you have a gardening area that has drainage issues. If it's a wet soil, say a lot of clay. If you're working with a soil or a plot that's been donated to you, say by a church or a local farmer, you have what you have. And so if you could put some raised beds up there, you don't necessarily have to build a box, but if you can pile the dirt up a little bit higher, say 3 or 4 more inches higher than the surrounding soil, that's a raised bed. It can provide a little extra drainage, allow that little mound to dry out a little bit more. Some raised beds, you see them off the ground considerably. That's for people's backs and knees. I spent some time in a wheelchair myself, and it's nice to have a bed that would be raised up about the same height as a wheelchair, so you could reach out there maybe 2 or 3 feet across the bed and be able to get to the vegetables at that height. If you're going to build a raised bed with some treated lumber, it's a good idea, but make sure that you're using the treated lumber that is new. Some of the older treated lumber from 15 or 20 years ago was treated with arsenic-based compounds. And, most of that's been used up. It's out of the pipeline now. But if you buy new lumber from some of the big box stores, chances are good that's going to be the newer lumber, and you can use that safely for treated in your garden for treated lumber, and it should be okay. In another consideration is if you have personal plots that people are growing, some of the crops like corn, for instance, grow very tall, and it tends to throw shade on other plants. So you may want to have those people say, hey, I'm going to grow corn, and put those folks on either the northern side of the garden or the eastern side of the garden. Probably northern is the best, but allow that not to throw shade upon the rest of the people's gardens there. That can start a few arguments too. As far as what to grow, first thing I always tell people is, grow what you like, but that's not always good advice, because some of the crops that you can grow in a garden are less productive per square foot. For instance, sweet corn. Love sweet corn, but it's kind of a space hog. It takes a lot of space for what you actually get for that plot. So if somebody has a 10 by 10 garden, they grow some sweet corn, they're not going to get a whole lot of ears out of that particular spot. Not a lot of production. The other things like vine crops, watermelon, muskmelon, cucumbers, also tend to take up a lot of space for what you actually get. Probably the most productive crops that are out there are things like tomatoes and beans and radishes and potatoes and that sort of thing. You'll get for what you do put into a small 10 by 10 spot. For instance, you're going to get a lot more production per square foot by weight than what you're going to get from sweet corn or the vine crops. As far as watering is concerned, same advice as we normally give for any kind of garden. Basically, you need about 1 inch of water for every 3 to 5 days if it's not provided by Mother Nature. So that means if we're in the middle of July and you get a 1/2 inch of water today, you could go out there and supplement another 1/2 inch, and you've got your water for the next 3 to 5 days. If it's hot, it'll probably be closer to 3 days when you'll need water. If it's relatively cool, you might be able to get by with 5 days, but gardens pretty much need water about every 3 to 5 days in Indiana, and about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of water at one big soaking. We also like to try to water in the morning hours versus watering it at 6 p.m. in the evening. Watering in the evening tends to encourage a lot of different diseases. If the plants stay wet overnight, if you water at 6 p.m., they're going to be wet till almost noon the next day, and that is a real recipe for encouraging a lot of different kinds of diseases. You water at 6 a.m. in the morning, those plants will be pretty much dry by the same time, about noon, and a lot less time being wet, which encourages molds and mildews and all the kinds of diseases that are out there. And of course, as I mentioned several times, it's really important to make sure that everybody knows what's going on when it comes to water, because nobody wants to get to the garden and find out they're watering today and turn around and have to go back home again. You hear a lot about rotating plots. That can help with some of the disease issues that build up in gardens, both at home and that sort of thing. But in a small plot, especially if you're doing tillage. The disease control aspects of rotation may not be as critical as they are, say, in a large field of corn or soybeans on a commercial level. So also, if you're going to rotate plots from year to year, gardeners who are in the habit of building up their soil fertility-wise may get kind of upset about rotating from one crop or one location in the garden to another the next year. Walkways are kind of important. Many locations in Indiana have places where you can go get wood chips or compost for free. Both Elkhart and Goshen cities have locations where you can go get wood chips and use those for pathways or walkways. And it is very helpful as far as having a good place to walk, but it can also keep weeds down and reduce some of the water loss around some of those plants too. How many people does it take to run a garden? Most of the gardens I'm familiar with have had at least 10 or 12 people kind of involved to be successful. You can probably get by with fewer, but the bigger the garden, the more people that you're going to need. It helps to have people with some diverse talents or interests out there, because everybody's got a little bit of a different take on their garden, and that can usually help quite a bit. It also helps to have people with connections. Maybe you need some help with getting a pump secured or worked on, or maybe you need some help just getting some signage up or getting some lumber out there to build some raised beds. Those people with the connections can really be very helpful. Or maybe just need some cash to help things get going. That can also be a big help to have those kind of connections out there too. So my biggest concern with these gardens is always, how do we avoid those midsummer blues? That the critical time seemed to be that very first hot spell. And that's about the time when I get telephone calls from some of the local community gardens say, look, our volunteers were there for planting. They were there for the first few weeks, and then seems like that big first hot spell that we had, they just kind of disappeared. Can you send us some master gardeners to help us get through the rest of the summer? And unfortunately, at that point, there's not a whole lot I can help out with that, because really the master gardeners are there for educational purposes, not really for providing labor. But it's important. And I think that's where the fun comes in. You have to keep it fun and exciting, because let's face it, gardening can be pretty hard work too. So if you can make it fun and interesting and a learning experience, that can sometimes help keep those blues from setting in there. The other critical time is when weeds take over. If, for instance, for me personally, on my own personal garden, I had a big garden for several years, and every year when I get back from the fair, about the end of July, first part of August, my garden was a weed patch, and I was always very discouraged about that. So I have stopped raising vegetables at home. It just made me hurt every time I'd come home after spending basically a month out at the fairgrounds. And so I have stopped raising vegetables on my own. I can actually buy them cheaper than I can raise them and not have to look at the weed patch. So getting people out there frequently to get the weeds controlled, that is pretty important. So just keep it exciting. I think that is the key thing. Keeping it exciting helps people reduce some of the frustration. Making it fun, making it exciting is always a part of keeping it going. So that's when you really need that leadership, that drill sergeant with a kind heart to kind of help you. And that's one thing I've seen with many of the Elkhart County gardens is particularly the ones associated with church community services. They've got some people there with some big hearts, and they do have a lot of drive and ambition, and they do seem to do a great job keeping people motivated when the time is getting critical there. So we have had at least one garden in the county that had container gardens, and it is a good idea when you have limited space. That's one thing. If you're using pots or something like that, they are portable. In this case, they use some big raised wooden beds that were not portable, and they can extend the season a bit because the soils are a little bit drier. You might be able to get the garden planted a little bit earlier, and maybe even keep it going for another year or another week or two in the fall. But and weeds tend to be less of an issue because you have this particular spot where your plants are growing. The disadvantage of having those container gardens, they're fairly easy to vandalize. They draw a lot of attention. People drive by there and go, oh, what's over there? And so there's a little bit more tendency to have vandalism there. Watering is more critical than ever in a raised bed type of a garden because you're elevating that garden. It's going to drain, so it needs to be watered even more frequently and deeper than what you would a regular garden. You also may have some limits on what kind of crops you can grow in a community container garden too, because not all crops, like say for instance potatoes, can be grown in a small little container plot on somebody's back patio. And you may also have some issues with winter storage of the pots, for instance, if you're trying to grow them that way. If you're growing in pots, one of the biggest disadvantages is that the pot temperatures tend to rise and fall with the air temperatures much quicker than soil temperatures do. So if the plant's root system gets hot, that can create some issues with those plants that are growing in those pots. So keeping them cool, keeping them moist can oftentimes be a bit of a challenge. Funding wise, a wish list is very nice. When a lot of times people, especially when it's first getting started, when there's a big community need perceived, it's really good to have a wish list because people say, what can I do to help? And that type of question comes up very frequently at the beginning, but not necessarily at the end. So having a wish list form at the beginning can be pretty critical to getting some of the resources that you might need at the very beginning. Having some publicity is also very helpful, either through the newspaper, radio, social media these days is pretty important too. And I've seen some people even going as far as going with GoFundMe type of a campaign to raise some money too for these sort of things. There are companies out there and corporations that will donate occasionally for these kind of things, and they may want you to have a tax ID number or a tax exempt number. A lot of times they don't, but especially if it's just getting off the starting blocks. But it is one thing that they may ask about. Some communities have access to community block grants and that sort of thing, and you might be able to get something from them. They just sent out some emails the other day saying that a lot of the community block grants have been awarded already. And you may also have some people that want to help out with, say, an Adopt a Garden type of a program where they can contribute and see the results of their contribution there in their community. The other question I get very frequently is, where can I get seed? Is there anybody out there who will donate seed? And in many communities around Indiana, just like here, the local gardening centers are really starting to disappear. So it's getting harder and harder to find a local garden center that will give you some seed just to get started. Those were typically the place to go to because they really understood the importance of having a good connection. But I did Google seed donations, and it turns out there's quite a few places that you might be able to get some seed. However, again, it's April 23rd today. It's getting pretty late in the season, and a lot of the places that were giving away seed may find it very difficult to be able to do that right now. So the big elephant in the room is COVID-19. And so I do want to mention that if you Google Purdue Community Gardens and COVID, you'll find a publication out there. It's about community gardens. and you'll be able to look at that. They've got a lot of the same advice that I'm talking about here today on dealing with COVID in a garden. Key points are: make sure you communicate with your audience, your potential audience, that they should not be visiting the garden if they feel ill. Just like you shouldn't be going out in public if you feel ill. Stay home. That's the message that everybody seems to be sending right now. Don't allow anybody into the garden if they're feeling ill. And there should be somebody there that when somebody comes up to the garden that you're not familiar with says, who are you and why are you here? And you know, you may need to control that entrance to the garden. You know, a lot of times, as I mentioned, it's typical community gardens have had tours, or they've had carry-ins or potlucks. In 2020, that's probably not going to be happening. We're going to have to be sitting a few feet apart, maybe sitting on park benches or on the ground, talking to each other from the 6-foot distance or better. So those community events that associated with these things may not be happening. That doesn't mean you can't invite reporters to come take pictures or have the group there working when they come take pictures, but community events probably shouldn't be happening in 2020. If you have a gate on your garden, it's probably good to have them open when people are coming in and out, because then they don't have to handle the gate, and they, you know, therefore risk the exposure of virus that may have been put on the handles of the gates and so forth. But then once the last person leaves, they're asked to close the gate. You know, if you have public benches, if you can cordon those off or put those away, that's one way of preventing another place where virus can collect. However, you may want some of those around just for the convenience of the people that are participating in the garden, just for a place to relax. If you can limit the size of the people working in the groups to 10 or fewer people, that would meet the standards that have been laid out by the CDC at this point. And if you can also have the coordinator of the garden stagger the times of arrival and availability to keep people from piling up in the garden, and therefore increasing the chances that virus can be shared back and forth between one person and another. You know, that I think we all know 6 feet apart has become the new norm. And so that's the key number there. If somebody can bring their own tools, that's wonderful. If you do have to share tools, of course, they would need to be cleaned off. A good cleaning mix is usually something that's maybe 1 part bleach to 10 parts water. Give it a good rub down and let that dry, and that should help out quite a bit with the virus sterilization. Any sort of plans that you can make as far as cleaning and sanitizing protocols are good. So here's a suggestion of things like doorknobs, water spigots, gates. Those kind of things should be looked at and cleaned pretty routinely. Hand washing, sanitizing stations in the garden would be helpful. And don't forget a reminder on how to properly wash hands, you know, for 20 seconds. Sing happy birthday 3 times or 2 times to make sure that you're getting your hands clean enough, and just particularly between the fingers, or wear gloves too. And if you do have visitors or volunteers come in, have them wash and sanitize their hands also. Again, if you're going to have somebody visit the garden, they should be, if they are feeling ill, they shouldn't be participating in the garden. So I'm going to skip over a couple of slides here, but maintaining that social distancing with the visitors to the garden is also just as important as the volunteers that are out there. Okay. Now, one of the questions, as I wrap up here, one of the questions we always get, since Purdue Extension has the Master Gardener program, is can the Master Gardeners help us out at the garden? So I threw in a couple of slides here about Master Gardeners. These are people that have been given some special training about gardening, and they in turn are supposed to do some volunteer work Probably the part that most people do not understand is that volunteer work that master gardeners do is educational in nature, not necessarily providing labor for going out and doing work in the garden. So it's to be done as far as teaching people how to become better workers of the soil and with plants. So master gardeners do have some policies in place right now. Right now through June 30th, master gardeners are not to have any face-to-face meetings, just like all Purdue employees are in that situation right now. The Purdue master gardeners can continue to educate the public virtually or by methods that that involve social distancing or travel, don't interfere with travel restrictions in their community. So there is some limited work that is allowed for demonstration gardens and food gardens, providing that the social distancing rules and travel restrictions are met. So can master gardeners help you? Perhaps, but we do need to take into account that we want to protect our volunteers here in Extension also, and we don't want those folks getting sick. They're a very valuable asset to the community. We don't want those people getting sick. So with that, I'm going to call it off and ask if anybody has any questions. If you can, just, if you got a question, unmute your mic and we'll see if we can take a few questions.
Jeff, this is
Yes.
There's a few questions in the chat room. One of them was, do you have any plot templates you can share from Maryland?
Any templates of what, the layout?
She just put, do you have any plot templates you can share? So she might, I'll be checking the chat box to see if she expands on that.
Okay. Everybody's garden is going to be a little bit different in what they want or assume, but generally speaking, you want the larger plants towards the back. So if you have an individual garden, those people that are planning to grow some sweet corn, perhaps they should be in the northern portions of the garden. If it's a community garden, same thing would go. Anybody who's planning on any type of taller plants should be located somewhere in the back. A lot of it's going to depend upon your particular situation layout for what kind of lot you've got. Small city lot, for instance, may have some ups and downs to it because of old foundations that have been removed here and there, and it could be a real challenge in some of those particular locations.
And Jeff, you said to mention or remind you about showing a picture of a sign.
Yeah, let me take down the screen here, and I guess I'll have to do it from the other thing here. Thank you for reminding me there, Tom. Purdue has come up with a sign that says, "Attention, gardeners and visitors," and then we'll make this available on our website. So you can see that, but you can print this out, post it. Probably if you're going to post it, I would suggest maybe getting it laminated. It's going to be outside during the weather. A little piece of paper is going to help very much, but it does tell visitors to the garden, do not enter the garden if you're feeling ill, practice distancing, wash hands, avoid touching your face, and refrain from using common areas such as benches and tables and handles and railings, and bring your own tools or disinfect your tools regularly. So it's just a kind of a reminder of things that can do, and we'll put that up on our site so that people can download those and post those at your gardens.
Jeff, another question is, any advice for allowing people to be responsible for watering their own plots?
Yeah, that's a great idea. That's a good question. We have people that do that in several different gardens around here. Watering your own plots, that's fine. The key thing is being able, they're going to have the equipment in order to haul that. When you're putting on an inch of water, essentially what you're trying to do is wet the soil to a depth of about 12 to 18 inches. Okay, that takes quite a bit of water. If you have a 10 by 10 plot, you're going to be hauling probably in the neighborhood of about 40 to 50 gallons of water each and every time you try to get that water to that depth. If you're going to go 1.5 inches deep, you're going to be talking another 50% more water than that. So it does take quite a bit of work to water it on your own. If you can come up with a community way of watering, it makes it a lot simpler for everyone else. The other thing that I've noticed in a couple of gardens is they do have a water collection system, maybe based on collecting water from roofs or gutters and so forth. It's a great tool to use. However, you do want to make sure that you have that screen so the mosquitoes can't get in there and cause you some problems. Elkhart County was one of the places in Indiana that has some issues with EEE last year, Eastern encephalitis, Eastern equine encephalitis, and if you do have a water barrel, please put a screen over it so the mosquitoes can't get to it.
Another question is, do you recommend landscaping fabric before putting the soil in the beds?
Good question. I have mixed feelings. What the landscaping fabric can often do deep is to keep some of the roots from coming up through the bottom, but it is going to rot eventually and create some problems, 5 or 10 years down the road when maybe you want to tear things up a little bit. What I've seen with landscaping fabric on the surface is that unless you mulch it, all the weeds are going to come up through it, every little crack and crevice. If you punch a hole in it to plant a tomato, for instance, immediately around that tomato plant, you're going to have some weeds pop up through there. You're also going to have some weed seed that blows onto the surface. You're going to end up having to rip those off. So if you are going to use landscaping mulch, consider putting, or if you're going to use the landscaping fabric, consider putting kind of mulch over the top of that. And just remember, you may end up with some weeds growing into that fabric anyway. For a while, they're pretty easy to pull out, but once they get rooted deep into that stuff, man, it can be tough.
And then we had Karen Ritchie mentioned Purdue Extension Mastering Home Food Preservation Instructors are a good resource for home food preservation questions. And then she put her contact information in the chat. And then another question is, would it be possible to make free compost available for people in Elkhart County? Compost is hard to find and expensive in this area. Yeah,
the landfill has been doing composting on a pretty massive scale. So I can talk to the folks up there and see if we can make that a little bit more available than it is currently. But they've actually got a machine that can turn it, and they share that with a couple of the other locations such as Goshen to help turn that too. But yeah, compost can be expensive, and if you can make some of your own at the garden, have a location, that can be helpful too. It's wonderful material. It can really help with improving your garden. Do you have any other questions there? Thank you for Virginia for helping out with the questions.
No problem. There's another one that just came in. Any direction on where to get free mulch in the Vermilion County, Indiana area?
I am not familiar with Vermilion County very well. I would suggest giving your extension office a call. They may have some answers for you.
I don't see any more questions in the chat, Jeff.
Okay.
I have a question, but I can't get it to go.
Okay.
Do you have a recommendation for the fencing height for protecting against critters, excluding deer? Deer can climb over anything.
Yeah, sure. Shirley, is it?
Yes.
Yeah. Excluding deer, if you're going for, let's say, groundhogs, raccoons, that sort of thing, raccoons are notorious for getting through just about anything. I don't know if there's anything that can actually exclude a raccoon if they really want to get to it. Something like a rabbit is fairly easy, actually. It doesn't take too much of a fence as long as you kind of lean it up against some poles. It won't take a whole lot. The trick with rabbits is making sure you're not fencing it into the gardening area, because they're really stealthy about hiding underneath your cabbage leaves or your green beans. And you think you fenced them out, and you actually fenced them in. With groundhogs, you really need to bury it to a certain extent, probably down as much as 2 foot or so. They will, if there's something good on the other side of that fence, they will make an effort to get there no matter what they can do. At my home, I found out the hard way that the groundhogs, if they want in someplace, they will dig underneath the fences, probably as deep as about 1.5 feet. So I would say 2 feet. I used a vinyl coated hardware cloth and buried that around and just put some simple posts up, and it did a fairly good job. But
We had another question. Oops,
will
I'm sorry.
find their way in.
Can Purdue Extension help with getting free seeds and plant starts to community gardens or low-income home gardeners in Elkhart County?
I've got some pretty good sources with the garden community here in Elkhart County. I can send out some emails. I don't know of very many places that are giving away seed at this point in time. If any of you out there, there's a lot of people from Elkhart County on this list. If anybody else knows of anything, please chime in and let us know if there are some good sources. But a lot of the seed for 2020 has already been spoken for. Any other questions? One of the things I'll do here in the next day or so is I'll try to get this. Okay, we do have a comment down here. The Church Community Services is giving out small seed packets. So apparently they've got access to some seed there. So if you're in Elkhart County, Church Community Services does have some seeds. That's no. But I will try to post on our Purdue Extension Elkhart County website a copy of a link to this particular program. It'll be posted on YouTube, and we'll also have links to the various handouts, including this presentation, so that you can print that out. And also, I've got some agreements, some agreements that I found on the web that are pretty interesting. Nobody wants to do paperwork, but yet paperwork can be a nice thing to have if you're trying to kind of protect yourself from liability. So I'll put those up there also. And see a note here that in Bartholomew County, the public library has started a seed library and free seeds for their community. So I imagine with so many of you from various parts of Indiana, every community is going to be jumping in and doing it a little bit different. One place to contact would be your extension office. They will probably have some ideas of who or what the agencies are within your community that are doing some things with the seed issues. Every community's got a little bit of a different twist to it. Okay, well, I wish everybody a very good week and a great summer. Up here, we've had a couple of extra snows that we don't normally get in April, and things are still a little bit wet, but they were out plowing yesterday. Hopefully that means things are going to get better as far as the soils are concerned. With that, I'm going to call it a day, and we'll be talking to everyone later. Take care.